In this episode of the Caustic Rebel podcast,
we're Canadians, and apparently we're going to wade into an in-depth discussion of the American political system.
Well, specifically the upcoming
Yes.
election, no?
The version of the talk I believe we're going to see is a review of some of the more what was the adjective you used, Brian? The elections that
were difficult. The presidential elections that were difficult to resolve. They were close. They were controversial. That was not a straightforward matter of counting the votes, declaring the winner, and going home.
Go report. Got it. Hello and welcome to the Caustic Rebel podcast. I'm Peter O'Shea, coming to you from Vancouver, Canada.
Yeah, and I'm Tom Quinn from, at the moment, Thun, Switzerland. And we have a special guest today, Dr. Brian Gaines, professor of political science at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And we know Brian from way back. We attended a geek camp together back in 1984. And we just celebrated
Well, first of all, this is directly from his website, which I invite you to go and look at the little University of BC. It's a little Canada. Look how he spells honors. I love it.
Oh, nice. I like it.
And then he name drops that he was on the ice hockey. He had to say ice hockey club at Stanford University, where he received his PhD.
I don't know. That's
that rankles a little that you had to put the word ice.
But there is a talented field hockey team there. So
yeah, fair enough. You don't want to run amok of those guys. But there you go, Tom. Most importantly, Brian was an alum of the 1-month program Canadian high school students could attend in 1984. It was a Shad Valley program run by the Canadian Centre for Creative Technology. There's Brian back in 1984. And this full disclosure, this is where we all met. That would be Tom, myself, and Brian. And that was 40 years ago.
We had our well dressed, and I was just wearing polo shirt.
Yeah, we weren't wearing dress pants, though. We were just wearing shorts. That was the in joke. We're Canadians, and apparently we're going to wade into an in-depth discussion of the American political system.
Well, specifically the upcoming election, no?
The version of the talk I believe we're going to see is a review of some of the more what was the adjective you used, Brian? The elections that were
difficult. The presidential elections that were difficult to resolve. They were close. They were controversial. That was not a straightforward matter of counting the votes, declaring the winner, and going home.
Okay. So at this point, do you have slides, Brian? Do you want to share those?
I do. I wasn't going to, I think I'll share them selectively. I'll just start in by saying, as we're recording, it's about 2 weeks from the 2024 election. It looks tied in the polls, but there are reasons to be doubtful about polls, but we don't really know who's going to win. So is 2024 going to be part of this in the future? I'm going to be talking about difficult resolutions, and maybe 2024 will be one of them. Let me start 200 years ago with 1824. What can go wrong in a presidential election? Well, the American presidential election is an indirect election, so people talk as though they're directly voting. They say, I'm going to vote for Trump, I'm going to vote for Harris, I could never vote for Obama. But you don't actually vote for those people unless you're a presidential elector. What you actually do is vote for a slate of electors. And it's a two-part process. The electors vote for the president later, not in November or in early voting just before November, but in December. And then Congress certifies that. Usually that's a trivial result, but in 2020, we saw a lot of chaos surrounding the certification. So there's another step. And then there's an inauguration in January. So it plays out over a period of time. Back to 1824, Lots of things that were different 200 years ago. One of the things that was different was the electors were not given out according to popular vote in every state. So now we think of this as, yeah, okay, there's some nonsense about electors that you just talked about, but basically the people vote, and then the winner is the person who gets the most votes most of the time. So that isn't true. The winner is the person who gets the most electoral votes. That's not the most popular votes necessarily.
Right.
So now I guess I ought to switch to, let's see if I'm going to show the right slides. That's not the right slide. Well, this will do. I So the winner is the person who gets the most. Let's do this as a proper slideshow, I guess. Let's cut to these. There we go. The most electoral votes. That's usually the candidate that gets the most popular votes, but it needn't be. Here's one of the. This is, I think, from Wikipedia, the source of all knowledge. A listing of elections in which the popular vote winner was not elected president. Back to 1824, Andrew Jackson says 42% of the vote. But John Quincy Adams was elected. Jackson would become president, but he wasn't the sixth, he was the seventh. He had to wait and get revenge in the next election. So what happened? How is it that Jackson didn't win? Well, the Electoral College ensures that can happen. It happens again a few more times down the line here. And I'm going to talk about 1960 being a case that's missing from this table. But there's more to this complicated case than just that Jackson didn't have the electoral vote, he had the popular vote. So I said not all the votes were given out in uh, with any popular vote. The Constitution says the legislature gives out the electors. The state legislatures decide how their electors are awarded. So 6 of them then didn't have a popular vote. The legislature just had a vote. So this is the four-way race, and I should pause and say that's not what we see right now. We have a two-way race, a Republican and a Democrat. That's kind of the modern American electoral system. But this was a period when the Federalist Party had withered. So we have four candidates, all basically from the same party. They're all Democratic Republicans. So, not what a modern election looks like, but it's going to turn out that the weird resolution here could arise even 200 years later. Nobody gets a victory in popular vote doesn't matter, electoral vote matters, but nobody gets an electoral victory. You need 131 to have a majority of the electoral votes. Jackson's got 99. Adams behind him with 84. Clay and Crawford trailing. What happens under the Constitution if nobody has a majority of the electoral vote? The U.S. House decides. So the U.S. House would decide, and I've given away the end of the story here with this red 13. Adams is elected. He gets the bare minimum of what you need in the House is not the same margin because these are no longer electoral votes. It's a majority of the states. So the number of states at the time is such that 13 is majority. Adams gets exactly what he needs. The usual story about this in history books is it was a corrupt bargain. Henry Clay, one of those who finished behind, who's eliminated in this House vote, said he wanted to be Secretary of State. Adams said, you were the Speaker of the House. You can twist some arms in the House and get me the votes I need. Indeed, Clay got his appointment, and this is a quote from Jackson. You see, the Judas of the West has closed the contract, will receive the 30 pieces of silver. Was there ever witnessed such a barefaced corruption in any country before? The answer to that question, I think, is yes. There was lots of corruption on long history of humankind. All kinds of countries saw more corruption. But so the first moral is in 2024, we won't have a four-way race. So there's no way that nobody will get a majority of the vote, right? Well, in fact, we have an even number of electors, 538. A 269 tie is not impossible. If you believe the polls right now, it looks like a knife-edge result. If there's a tie, nobody has 270 or more, then it would go to the House.
What am I looking at here? I love graphs.
I love it. So that's the first thing. And that I think people would think a resolution by the House doesn't sound modern at all. 1824, maybe it fits the times. That would be very bothersome. It would be a real problem. I won't disagree with that, but I want to poke a hole in the usual historical account of this corrupt bargain. It was decided in the House. It probably wasn't a corrupt bargain. It's probably perfectly sincere voting. So here is a picture of the U.S. House at the time. It's not a picture of a painting of the actual members. It's a picture of a two-dimensional ideological space. So we want to know, how would these guys vote? How are they going to vote? Do they have to make side deals and get bribes from Clay? Jackson was probably offering bribes and inducements as well. What would it look like if there were no bribes, there's no strategy, there was no coercion, they just voted the way they usually vote? Well, we know how they voted. They cast lots of roll calls. It's all written down and recorded. So you write down a pretty standard spatial model and say, suppose people vote according to where they are in space. If they're on the left, they vote for leftist things. They're on the right, they vote for rightist things. Maybe it's not one dimension, maybe it's two. So there's a second dimension. We could think of instead of the left and right, the top and the down. This is a picture that the markers indicate whether the members are from the south or the northeast, but where the members of the House were at the time. And it happens that all these candidates, Crawford, Jackson, Adams, and Clay, and this is Calhoun, who was up for vice president. He's not part of the story, really, had also cast roll call votes. We can put them in the same space. It's a popular technique in political science to grab these roll calls to extract the so-called ideal points, where you can think about these people being in space, and then what would they vote for? If they're choosing between two options, they vote for the thing that's closest to them. Choosing between three options, they sincerely vote for the one that's closest to them. You start by noticing that Adams and Clay are pretty close in this space. They're very similar in the first dimension. They're very similar in the second dimension. You might think, wait, what are these dimensions? Is one of them economics and the other one is something to do with slavery, or is it something about social policy? And that's not imposed on the model by the people doing the estimation. You just let the data speak. So we could argue about what they are. We could attach labels. In some respect, we don't really care what they are. They're just patterns of voting. And whether I think there's one or two or three dimensions, I can let the data tell me which model fits best. But it's going to turn out not to matter whether I think it's a one-dimensional or a two-dimensional world. And in this case, three is definitely not needed. If I think, all right, so each member is going to vote for whoever's closest, these guys are probably going to vote, when they're choosing Clay's out of the story, they'll vote for Adams. These people are largely going to vote. Maybe they'll vote for Crawford. Maybe they'll vote for Jackson. These guys in the middle, it's a tough call. They might be about equally far. You do your predictions, and I'll say again, the members of the House here are not voting individually. They're going to vote within their state caucus, and then the states will cast votes. So the way that Adams will ultimately win is by getting a majority of the states. If the state has only one member, that person's within the date gets to cast the state's vote. If it has two members, they might tie, and then the state would abstain. If it has three members, it'll be a 2-1 vote, one way or the other, or a 3-0 vote. So you just predict in spatial terms how they should have voted and see how they did vote. And it looks like no matter how you cut it, Adams didn't really get very many votes he wasn't supposed to get. Jackson did. Crawford may have gained. But Jackson's the one who's winning states where the people voting weren't really closest to him. So this is all the work, not by me actually, but by a former student of mine, one of my former colleagues, who said this whole corrupt bargain story the historians love is probably not right. If you just think about how the members of the House would have voted naturally and then say, yeah, they probably vote for the closer of the candidates, you can extract that from the roll call data, and it looks like it was a sincere vote. So the good news for 1824, maybe there wasn't a corrupt bargain. The bad news is the president wasn't chosen by the people, it was chosen by the House. And if that happens now, nobody's going to be happy with it, whether there's a corrupt bargain or not. I think there would be lots of rumors swirling that somehow Trump or Harris was trying to buy House votes. So probably people would be dismayed and regard it as not a very democratic outcome if we ended up with the House resolving. But that's still part of the American presidential system, that nobody gets a majority of the electors, then it goes to the House. It's a lot more likely to happen in a four-way race, but because it's an even number of electors, it could still happen in a two-way race, as like we're looking at right now. I'm pausing to see if you want to.
Is it what is it sort of like something weird has to happen, like one has to win Mississippi and the other has to win Hawaii, and there's like a weird combination that has to occur in addition to the 268 or whatever the number is?
69. Yeah. So, it's a fun probability problem, or in a combinatorics class or something. Have the students calculate how many ways are there to get a 269 split from what are effectively 56 electoral college districts, the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and then two states, Maine and Nebraska, allocate their electors in such a way they can split them. They give the two electors that the state gets for the Senate to the winner of the state. And then they give, in each congressional district, whoever gets the most votes gets the elector that's matched to that member. So that's how I get to 56. So there are these five weirdo electors that are the congressional districts in these two small states. Take those numbers and play with them. You can find lots of ways to get, there aren't that many ways to get a 269 tie, but there's not one. It doesn't take a really freakish outcome. It just takes the right mixture of the combination of states breaking towards Trump and going towards Harris. So could go to the House. There's one other thing I could mention, that what if it turns out it's a 271 to I get my math right, it's a 67. It doesn't have to be a tie exactly. What if it's just barely outside the tie range? The electors are human beings. They aren't just automatic weights. So they're supposed to vote as they're pledged. They're picked because they're party loyalists. If you pick a slate of Trump electors for the state of Mississippi, they're mostly people that like Donald Trump, wanted to be president. They're mostly going to vote for Trump. But in the history of the American elections, there are actually a fair number of surprises where one of these electors cast a vote that was a surprise. They didn't vote as they were pledged to vote. They were so-called faithless elector. So you could get a situation where nobody gets 270 or more because of a handful of faithless electors if it's close enough. Last couple of faithless electors were in 2000. One of the DC electors did not vote for Gore to protest DC not having statehood. At that point, she knew Bush had won, and so it was sort of a costless symbolic vote, and she got some attention. In 2004, one of the Minnesota electors, Democratic electors, voted for John Edwards instead of John Kerry. So John Edwards got one electoral vote, and that, by all accounts, was a mistake. It wasn't a protest of anything. It was
The
just
wrong John.
didn't have coffee that morning and thought, which one of these guys? Wait, oh, Edwards. No, I meant Kerry. Oops.
Oh, no.
Too late now. So the mere fact that within a two-way race, most of the time, with very high probability, we won't get nobody getting over 270. So we haven't gone back to the House since 2024. They haven't had to resolve an election, but it's not impossible to get the tie, and it's not impossible to get it through this weirder method that somebody could be faithless, spring a surprise, and turn what should be a very narrow win into nobody getting the majority.
What is the more like? I mean, I remember a few years ago there was, what was it? Bush and Gore.
Yeah, we're back to 2000.
Okay. That was a contested election, wasn't it? I mean, that was somewhat different, perhaps, in so far as it came down to like recounting ballots and hanging chads, and it was like they were splitting things so incredibly down the middle that it defies belief.
Let's talk about 2000. We can I'll come back and talk about 1876 a little bit too, and maybe 1960.
Okay, sorry.
2000.
More graphs.
The Electoral College, the Republican margin. So if it's above the 0 point, Republicans won the state. If it's below, Democrats won it. And the markers are proportional to the size of the state in electoral votes. And then the horizontal axis is less important here, but it's the Electoral College bonus. It's comparing how much weight does this state have in popular vote, how much does it have in electoral vote. And for the moment, just ignore that and notice that here's a big state. This is California. It's below the line. The Democrat won it. This is Gore winning, wins it handily, gets a lot of votes. This is Texas. Bush wins it pretty handily. Florida is right on the line. It's a big state. When one state is at 50%, then maybe it matters, maybe it doesn't matter. It matters if the rest of these states balance out so that you're very close to that 270 threshold. And they were very close to that 270 threshold. Let's see if I can find the right figure. That's not it. Wrong way. Here we are. Now I'm counting up the cumulative electoral votes. This is the same margin. So the vertical axis, again, is just how far are we from a dead tie. When you're above it, it's won by the Democrat. Below, it's by the Republican. Start marching off to the left here. We've got the states the Republicans win easily, and they're accumulating. This is Bush accumulating electoral votes. He crosses 270 with Florida, and Florida is right on the 50 line. And at this scale, you can't tell that Bush is ahead because he's ahead by a couple hundred votes out of millions. The next sense in which this was a close election was there are a lot of Democratic states here, New Mexico, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Oregon, that were within 1%. So it's not inconceivable they could have been won by Bush instead of by Gore. But nobody paid much attention to how close the result was there because in the end, the winner of this election was going to be whoever won Florida. Florida was knife edge close, and it was called for Bush, and there was a lot of dispute about let's do some recounting. And after a fairly chaotic recount, court decisions, some state level conflict, and then the Supreme Court of the United States intervening, Bush got it, and he won it by just hundreds of votes. So close can mean close in popular vote, but popular vote's not the way you win the presidency. Close could mean close in electoral vote, and a close electoral vote might include very close states, or it could be close electoral vote, but none of the states is very close, so there's not really anything to fight about. Or you can get the huge fight that occurs when one of the states is this close, and I think it's effectively within what you might think of as the margin of error. That voting is a recording of preference. We record the preferences of a lot of people, millions in a big state like Florida. On a lot of things, the ballots are long. They're voting on president at the top, but they're moving down, voting on county commissioners and coroners and you name it.
Well, you just pointed out an example of a member of the Electoral College kind of getting it wrong. So, yeah. I mean, how about the thousands of people that made it, not to mention the imperfections of the voting machine, etc. So yeah, for sure, it's in the margin of error.
Yeah, and then this was close enough. It was I mentioned the recounts. It would be boring for people who aren't extremely interested in politics to go through the details of the recounts. But part of what happened was they recounted the ballots, and they recounted them in different ways in different counties, and then it became a question of fairness. Do you have to have an exact standard applied the same way? And then there's a time pressure. An election for the U.S. Senate or for a governorship you can kind of take your time and try to get the details right. And if it takes a long time to do the recount, it's not that critical to be missing one senator. But you gotta have a president. You can't really leave the presidency vacant. So the voting takes place in early November. There's about a month until the Electoral College votes. There's about a month until the Congress certifies, and less than a month before the inauguration. It's not that much time if you've got to resolve really messy things like what do we do about this badly formatted ballot that seems to have resulted in some people voting not the way they wanted to. What do we do with these paper ballots that once we look closely at them, we find hundreds of them are kind of ambiguous. Hundreds doesn't matter if the margin is in the many thousands, but when the margin is in the hundreds, then suddenly all eyes are on all these little warts that aren't usually obvious. And I think it's sort of fair to say it's impossible to say with any kind of certainty who should have won Florida in some objective sense. The process by which we record the preferences is messy enough. There's enough error that we don't really know when it's this tight. We probably don't know who won New Mexico, but nobody paid any attention because it didn't matter. It didn't have enough electoral heft. But Florida was going to be the winner was going to be whoever got Florida, and in the end, it was Bush. Some people were indignant that the U.S. Supreme Court entered the story and finally made the decision. But there wasn't a naturally fair way to resolve it. If it weren't the U.S. Supreme Court, if the Florida Supreme Court got the last word and said, let's keep these recounts going, that would be, in some respects, more problematic. The Florida Supreme Court was, at the time, was all Democrats, even though it was a 50-50 state. And this is clearly a question of national interest. They weren't electing the governor of Florida. They were electing the president of the United States, even though Florida was where the action was. Because the Electoral College focuses the count state by state, it didn't change the fact that there was an obvious national interest in getting this resolved in some respect fairly. So there are law professors who still are writing furious articles about how the Supreme Court ought to have stayed out of it and left it to Congress. But I don't think it's clear that the Supreme Court didn't have an interest.
I hope we get to talk to you again, Brian. I know you're super busy. Oh, this is good stuff. Like, are you exhausted? Are you fraught? Like, are you able to surf maybe some of the tension or worry better or worse than somebody that doesn't know the details?
No, I think I'm more relaxed because I think once you know the history, you think the country's made it through a lot of messes. And when I'm often a naysayer when people say, we've never seen a country so polarized, I say, oh, we certainly have. And I just tell stories about the 1860s and the 1850s. And
I think that's definitely a theme that I need to hear from people that know what they're talking about. But if it's not true, it's not going to help me. But I like the thing you just said is gold.
Tune in next time, dear listener, as your dynamic duo tackle other daunting questions with other guests. Stay tuned for our upcoming 3-part series with Conor McGregor.
Well, a wrecking ball is swinging, ringside bells are ringing.